So a few introductory remarks to set the scene. That's a little too close to me, I think. So the title of this panel, and I expect we're going to have a lively and productive argument as we go forward, and I'll be delighted to have people in the audience participate as we get into it, is on intellectual diversity. We talk about diversity, and lately there have been more and more voices saying, well, maybe intellectual and indeed viewpoint diversity is important to the serious understanding of that term. Diversity today too often means its opposite. It means a conformity, right? Along with this is a bit of data, which is, at least in some studies of elite universities, the number of conservatives in humanities and social sciences has been in decline for the last 2 or 3 decades. And that contributes to reinforcing the ideological homogeneity of universities. And the consequence of this is maybe perhaps best explained by a prominent center-left thinker. And that would be Cass Sunstein of Harvard Law School, who writes about 2 articles a day. There's an old article of his. Steve, tell us, do you know this one, The Law of Group Polarization? Yeah, it's almost 20 years old, but it holds up quite well, I think, and I very much commend it to you. You can find it posted on the SSRN. And what Professor Sunstein says in that article is, well, a lot of things, but he says it's surprising to him that there haven't been more careful studies of group polarization. And he goes through what literature exists of different fragments of it. And he makes a point that I think is intuitive to a lot of us, which is groups, when they deliberate together, become more extreme. Now, he never singles out its applicability to any academic departments, although I think that's probably in the back of his mind in this article. And so I commend that to everyone. In recent, I think months is almost the right time frame, there are a number of academic liberals who are starting to say the lack of intellectual and viewpoint diversity is a problem. Most prominently, Michael Roth of Wesleyan University, who I remember from graduate school more than 30 years ago expressing pretty radical left views, maybe not radical left, but certainly firmly left views. Now president of Wesleyan, I suspect the reason he wrote in the Wall Street Journal some months ago that there needs to be, as he put it, I think in an unfortunate phrase, affirmative action for conservatives in academia. And some of the ideas he and others have had are a little bit odd, like maybe military veterans, which is sort of fine, but that begins to suggest one of the problems, which is there's a two-way street here. There may be a supply problem. There are a couple parts of this I'll bring up during our discussion, but I'm going to leave it to our panelists to lay out the dimensions of this problem. And we're going to start first with April Kelly Wessner from Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania. She's a political scientist, does a lot of work with some of the survey data from the Higher Education Research Institute and elsewhere. She's the co-author with Stanley Rothman of the Still Divided Academy, How Competing Visions of Power, Politics, and Diversity Complicate the Mission of Higher Education. Our second panelist is Stephen Tellis, political scientist from Johns Hopkins University, who assures me, in fact, that he is a liberal, except I sometimes don't believe him. And I've actually accused him of being a double agent. And the reason I say that is some of the, to my mind, very perceptive books on, in particular, the rise of the conservative legal movement. I'm familiar with a lot of books written by liberals about conservatives that just don't go more than the surface level, and they aren't really very good. His books are good. I commend to you in particular his latest book, co-authored with Brink Lindsay, called The Captured Economy, How the Powerful Enrich Themselves, Slow Down Growth, and Increase Inequality. And I've talked to Steve about his thoughts on the subject of this panel, and he has some very useful, I think, challenges for those of us on the right. So I will take you at your word that you're a liberal, though I still think you fail miserably at it sometimes. And then following him, our third panelist is Joshua Dunn of the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs. And here's the interesting thing. Josh and Steve Tellis had the same dissertation advisors at the University of Virginia, which means that group of people failed with one of them. I'll put it that way. Josh Dunn, with his co-author John Shields, is the author of an important book with Oxford University Press a year or 2 ago now called Passing on the Right, Conservative Professors in the Progressive University. Conducted extensive anonymous interviews with conservative faculty around the country I think I was the only conservative academic named in the book, and that's because I had the sandwich board I walked around with, and I was out in public. I was outed, right? So we'll start with April, and we will proceed from there. And you want to speak from the podium, I think? Yeah.
I'm going to talk from the podium because if I sit, I'll put myself to sleep, and then I'll only go downhill from there. So I tend to be more animated here. So should I wait for the protesters? Because I was told that there were protesters at Berkeley, and I've never experienced that in this. Looking forward to it. So I'll also start off by saying last night at dinner, George and I were talking, and I realized that we were making a lot of the same conclusions, which was amusing until I realized he went first, and then it just became terrifying. So then I just secretly hoped for sabotage. I talked to his daughter about the laptop. It all worked out well. So thank you so much for inviting me. My talk today will focus on political intolerance on campus. So political intolerance is my latest area of research. And I think there's a great deal of evidence that political tolerance is declining among America's youth. But I'm going to argue against the notion that our colleges are filled with these overconfident, radical leftists seeking to impose their political will on others, the image of the social justice warrior. And I'm going to argue that there are those students on campus, and they are engaging in the virtue signaling that we thought, and outrage tends to spread, so we have to watch these groups. But I'm going to argue that they're still in the minority. And if you actually started counting student opinions on campus, much like George has done, you will see that what's happening is not this huge number of social justice warriors, but rather a large number of students who are just passive and apathetic about free speech issues. And so we have this far number who are simply allowing intolerance and passively supporting restrictions on speech. So to be clear, there is an increase in political intolerance among America's youth, but I think that a lot of this is coming from a place of political apathy. And that intolerance is a growth mostly of insecurity, anxiety, and heightened perceptions of threat. And one of the most promising solutions to the problem of heightened perception to threat is exposure to reasoned, principled intellectual diversity. And I use those words, reasoned and principled, very deliberately because I think they're important, and I'll explain why. First, we need to be clear what we mean by political tolerance. And I didn't know I'd be speaking mostly a political scientist, so I went into an explanation here. But I often hear people talk about the youth as a particularly tolerant group. And they cite evidence that they are more accepting of homosexual rights, they are more accepting of rights for minorities and historically repressed groups. That is not what social scientists mean by political tolerance. Political tolerance is not about who you like, it's about how you treat the people you don't like. And everybody dislikes somebody. And so what has happened over time is this shift in who we dislike. And so the study of political intolerance started in the 1960s with Samuel Stauffer's work on communism, right? And he found that Americans were a really intolerant bunch towards communists, and that large majorities of Americans would not allow a communist to speak in their community, especially would not allow a communist to teach college. Of all the tolerance majors that were harshest when it comes to college professors, and would not want and would support removing or banning a book by a communist in their public library. And so this is what we mean by intolerance. It's whether or not you're willing to give those rights and freedoms to the groups that you find threatening or offensive. Samuel Stauffer offered some hope for the future, though, and he and other researchers that followed him found that one of the best predictors of tolerance was age or youth. And so they found in study after study after study that young people were always more politically tolerant than their parents. And so this led them to conclude that America is just going to get more and more tolerant over time through generational replacement, right? That hasn't happened. And so I presented some research at a couple conferences, and it's on the Heterodox Academy website if you want to see the nice charts. Looking at the General Social Survey, which has traditionally been used to track tolerance over time, we are seeing for the first time a reversal of that trend line. So young people today are now less politically tolerant than their parents, for the first time since we started measuring political tolerance in the 1960s. There has been some debate recently, just this past month, in op-eds and social media about the extent to which this is really a problem, if liberal college students are really becoming less tolerant. And George tapped into this a little bit in his talk. But for example, Nathan Robinson wrote in an article in Current Affairs titled "The Stereotypes About College Students and Free Speech Are False," arguing that this isn't really happening. And some of my colleagues at Heterodox Academy have responded to this, showing data that yes, it is. I think the disagreement hinges on a measurement issue. It's not a new issue. So research on political tolerance has always found that there's this disconnect between people's broad support for general principles of free speech, like George talked about. Yes, I support free speech. In the case of the students, yes, I support an open environment that would allow free speech. And then there's this, what we call slippage, when it comes to actually applying that to groups that you find threatening and situations that are actually happening on campus or anywhere. So we say we support free speech, but not if it's for racists or not if it's for, right? So we make these exceptions. And so I'd be curious to see what happens when you actually, when you actually push them on that issue. So this slippage is occurring in the face of perceived threat, right? When you have a threatening group, then those principles get relaxed. And I think this perception of threat is especially important when we're talking about what's happening now on campus, because there's a great deal of evidence that young people today, what we would call Generation Z, or what some people are calling iGen, have a heightened sense of threat and anxiety over social conflict and political disagreement. And so I wasn't surprised at the results that students are self-censoring, mostly because they're afraid of those social perceptions among their peers. I do think that Nathan Robinson and others are correct in pointing out that this is not a college student problem. It is still the case that people who attend college are significantly more tolerant than their peers who do not. And it is also true, as Robinson points out, that this isn't a liberal problem. Liberal tolerance has declined, but it's only declined to meet conservative levels. So they too are now statistically insignificant in models of intolerance. It used to be that the left were the proponents of free speech, and we've lost that. The two groups most likely to trigger intolerance today are not communists, but racist and radical or anti-American Muslims. One tends to trigger the left more, one tends to trigger the right more, but the relationship between ideology and which of those groups you are intolerant towards is not as strong as you might think. Both liberals and conservatives tend to be intolerant towards racists, and intolerance towards one group tends to be positively correlated with intolerance towards another. So it is not just the case that liberals are intolerant towards conservatives and conservatives are intolerant to liberals. What seems to be happening is that when you are intolerant towards one group, it creates this culture of intolerance, and people apply this fairness principle where they say, well, if that offensive group can't speak, then my offensive group can't speak. And so there's this overall suppression of speech, and everyone starts to perceive the environment as less open. Although intolerance has been directed towards different groups at different times, and baseline levels tend to shift, there are still consistent predictors of tolerance. Age until recently, education, which is still true, and perception of threat, which is always one of the biggest predictors of tolerance. This perception of threat is an important piece of the puzzle in trying to explain what is happening with young people, and it would predict that intolerance would be on the rise. So in her book on iGen, Jean Twenge uses mass survey data to paint a compelling picture of a generation raised on their smartphones. These young people, born between 1995 and 2012, who are our current college students, differ in some significant ways from other generations. They have fewer face-to-face social interactions with their peers, even friends. They have higher levels of depression, are more anxious about social interactions, and are generally very risk-averse. They are preoccupied with safety, both physical safety and emotional safety. So our students have a heightened sensitivity to emotional harm. This isn't inherently a bad thing. A citizenry of empathetic people who are sensitive to the emotional needs of others could be a very positive development. But there are some very unintended side effects to this, and the strategies they have learned to use online to protect themselves from emotional harm are being applied to real-life human interactions in ways that are destructive to their own growth and learning. iGen has grown up online, and they live their lives online. They construct online personas. These are carefully crafted. And then the primary threat to these is cyberbullying and public shaming. They have learned that words inflict real harm and describe their response to social shaming and unkind words as violence. They describe it as if it was a physical assault. In the social media world, students can easily unfriend, unfollow, or block somebody who challenges them. Online social interactions are literally evaluated according to the number of likes one receives. It's a system designed to measure self-worth according to affirmation and agreement. I wouldn't call these young people snowflakes. In fact, I have two very strong-willed kids in this cohort. And I think in many ways they are handling pressures and real challenges that previous generations did not have to confront. Real questions about their economic futures and job prospects. And being risk adverse from a parental perspective is not necessarily bad. We've seen a drop in underage drinking, a drop in reckless driving, and teen pregnancies among this group have declined. In many ways, they are remarkably responsible. But I do think we see a generation that has limited experience navigating real human conflict and disagreement, and that sees hurtful words as akin to physical threat. They have applied the rules of their artificial online worlds broadly, choosing to block and unfollow those with whom they disagree, whether it be an obnoxious internet troll or a campus speaker whose peers one has identified as a threat. The real-world version of unfriending or unfollowing is uninviting or non-platforming. And this isn't to say that there aren't real threats to which the students are responding to. Student protests against gun violence are a response to legitimate physical dangers. But I think most of us can point to examples where the threat has been imagined or greatly exaggerated, and students' reactions disproportionate to the situation. And in the case of Charles Murray, where students chanted that he was racist, sexist, anti-gay, despite his public and open stance in favor of gay rights, students seem to, at times, just be getting it wrong. And yet their fears, anxieties, and emotions seem very real. And colleges have often reinforced these fears. College presidents who sent sympathetic letters to students after Trump's election in an attempt to recognize their feelings probably reinforced their anxieties. And same thing with the deans we talked about in Amy's case, right? Pandering to students' anxieties, reinforcing those anxieties with their responses. When people have irrational fears and exaggerated fears at the extreme, we call them phobias. And one of the most widely used treatments for phobias is exposure therapy. We need to do the same with this growing fear of disagreement. Students need to experience it to learn that they can survive it, that disagreement isn't as threatening as they have imagined. And experiencing discomfort is a natural human reaction inherent in real social interactions. They will experience it in life, and college needs to prepare them accordingly. Those 4 years needs to be a transition period between their online worlds and the realities of life. And so I think it is unfortunate that students come in ill-equipped to deal with disagreement, but I think it's a tragedy if they leave that way. And so I'm arguing for a rule of higher education helping to curtail the growth of political intolerance. It does not mean that higher education is responsible for it. On the contrary, we seem to be doing something right as education still increases tolerance. But we need to do more to engage students in productive, rational dialogue with people with whom they fundamentally disagree on big philosophical and political questions. There is evidence in social psychology and political psychology that exposure to disagreement works. It increases tolerance. Political psychologists have found that people become more tolerant when they engage in discussion with unlike-minded people. And my own analysis confirms this. So I did some research at my own college. Students' tolerance is predicted by the intellectual diversity even within their major. So our students within majors that have a big mix of intellectual diversity show more tolerance than students that are in homogeneous majors. And that even includes whether if it's a more conservative major or a more liberal major. The mix seems to produce tolerance. And I've looked roughly at some of the hairy data, and the trend seems to hold nationally, although my results there are still a little preliminary. So when people have a problem with snakes, we don't cure it by throwing them into a pit of vipers, right? And if students are anxious about and threatened by disagreement, we don't resolve it by bringing the most bombastic, infamous, offensive, or aggressive speakers to campus to insult them. In this way, I think some of the political activists on the right have done damage to what they proclaim to be their own cause. I defend the right of students to bring these people to campus, but as an advisor, I always recommend that they consider what their purpose and goal is. If your purpose and goal is to convince students that there's something worthy in conservative thought, I would like you to bring somebody to campus who is principled and represents the best of conservative thought rather than the worst of conservative thought. So far, my students have all heeded my advice. So we need to do more of this, engage people in polite, civil, intellectual discourse that allows people to disagree calmly over coffee on matters of principle. But my argument, and that of many others today, is rooted in the belief that the university is a place of discovery, a place where ideas are exchanged in the pursuit of truth. I also believe that education has that civic mission that others have talked about, to create an informed citizenry capable of critiquing government action and holding government accountable. But many young people don't share this view today. Rather, they believe that higher education is a place for career training. iGen doesn't want to debate philosophy, consider the meaning of life, or just become a better person. They are at the university seeking credentials for employment. The result is that the arguments that we are making here and elsewhere fall on deaf ears. Students don't see these issues as legitimate components of their education, and we can't keep talking amongst ourselves. We may not be able to sway a generation of students to reconsider the meaning of education and their perspective on education, which is really very much in line with the economic realities they are facing. They may not have the luxury of finding meaning in life, so we may need to articulate our mission in their terms. The ability to navigate intense disagreement and consider other perspectives is not only a life skill or a civic skill, but also a career skill. And so our students will encounter political and social disagreement in the workplace. In fact, this is where Americans, according to research, tend to encounter the most political disagreement. Because like many of us in this room know, we can't pick our colleagues. And so this is where you're going to run into people with whom you otherwise would not choose to associate. Companies cannot afford to hire employees who consistently file complaints whenever a coworker says something mildly offensive, or who refuse to work with somebody because they disagree with them politically. So in summary, political tolerance is declining among America's youth. It is not a higher education problem in the sense that we created it, but it is a higher education problem in the sense that it has profound consequences on what we do here. And there is a higher education solution. Intolerance is a product of threat, and young people today have a heightened sensitivity to emotional threats. This is simply the result of inexperience. They are coming to college with less experience navigating social conflicts and disagreements, and the solution is to expose them to reasoned disagreement and intellectual diversity in an environment that reduces threat rather than intensifies it. This means that yes, we need intellectual diversity in higher education so that we can model reasoned debate for our students. Having a professor you know and respect with conservative views participate in a civilized panel debate with your liberal professors is a productive form of exposure therapy. It helps students realize that the fear and conflict around disagreement is artificial. This is a much better solution than inviting a small group of notorious conservative speakers to come to campus. This becomes much more threatening. This is an external force with whom students have no other relationship, brought to campus for the sole purpose of agitating or at least of being the other. The first approach of talking with your professor is aimed at educating students and reducing tolerance. The second approach fans the flames of political intolerance for the purpose of scoring political points or making profits on speaker fees. One is productive exposure therapy, the other is the pit of vipers. The educational mission of the university requires a softer, more subtle approach based on highlighting and promoting intellectual diversity within the university, a true openness of ideas, but it is our failure to provide this that has triggered the more aggressive and destructive response, which fuels the spread of intolerance. Thank you.
Do you want to stay there or up there?
I'll stay here. I'll stay here. So I saw when you said that we don't, people with phobias, we don't throw them in a pit of vipers. And I looked at Josh, and Josh, I had that look like, we don't.
Not if you want to keep your license.
So yeah. So when I was thinking about this, the topic is on the size of the cohort of conservatives in campus, and how do we explain this phenomenon, which seems to be small and to some degree shrinking. And I was thinking that there's a lot to be a lot of traction to be gained by thinking about some of the parallels with the situation of African Americans, right? And so there's actually quite a large literature out there, some of which in the economics of social interactions, which helps us think about this phenomenon. So when people usually think about why is a group underrepresented, right? The first theory they usually draw on is discrimination theory, right? And this is also the category of explanation that conservatives most readily reach for, right? They're, in any discrimination theory, the factors that explain low group attainment are mainly operative at the stage of the hiring decision, right? So you're making a hiring decision, you're going to hire somebody, an illegitimate consideration, in this case ideology, is used to cause a more qualified candidate not to be chosen. Now that could be because of conscious bias, so people actively saying we don't want conservatives here, right? Or it could be implicit bias, that is similarly qualified candidates are assessed as viewed differently because an individual is judged by the unconsciously assessed average quality of their group, right? So in that case, people don't say we don't want conservatives, but they have somewhere in the back of their mind that conservatives are inferior and they treat the person like their perceived average of the group. There's some evidence of this, right? There's some studies, Josh refers to some of them in his book. I'm not overwhelmed with the quality of some of the research that's been done on the extent of discrimination. It's still a little spotty, but we certainly know there's lots. I mean, I was just thinking about the department that you come from. Did not seem like it was going to be one that would be overly enthusiastic about hiring equally qualified conservatives, right? So that's one general theory, right? It's a low representative pattern is a result of illegitimate considerations entering at the hiring stage, and there's an obvious set of remedies, right? Which is, either if you think it's explicit, then you might actually want quotas or something like that. If you think it's implicit, then you're going to send people to a bunch of counseling sessions with people who are going to rid you of your anti-conservative bias. So that's one set. The second theory, right? So that's usually the side that people on the left are on, right? They're usually on the side that it's discrimination, but that's of course usually now the side that conservatives on. They're saying there's lots of discrimination, and that's why there aren't more of us. The second theory, which is usually the conservative theory, is what you might call the group attributes theory. So defenders of an employment status quo typically argue there is, in fact, no use of illegitimate considerations and that the hiring decisions reflect the actual qualifications of candidates. That's a position that conservatives usually find themselves making in discussions of discrimination with those to their left. In this case, the argument is usually that one, conservatives are stupider than liberals, right? So we and I'm not making this up, right? There's plenty of people who are doing IQ studies that would be not out of place in a Charles Murray study. If you just simply did one of those Mad Libs and you replaced some of the nouns, they would look like Charles Murray, right? Second, conservatives are greedy or simply not interested in the life of the mind, right? So they're not stupider, but they're greedy, and they all want to be Wall Street bankers. Third, those who are interested in the life of the mind are conservers rather than creators, and the modern university legitimately prioritizes creativity and conceptual breakthroughs over the transmission or the perpetuation of knowledge. So I actually think there's probably something to some of these claims, too, just as there's evidence for the discrimination theory. But again, it's interesting to note the irony of the inversion of the usual positions here on discrimination. Conservatives typically argue that group distribution represents the naturally clustered allocation of groups by field, or represents malpreparation at earlier stages in the process, right? So it's either that they say, well, look, there are plenty of, Korean computer scientists, and nobody thinks that's a problem. So, we shouldn't expect an equal distribution of people across fields. Maybe that's the same thing is true in university faculties, right? That would be one kind of counter argument along these lines, right? Or in more extreme circles, they argue that it represents inherent hardwired features of the group that we should just, quote, be honest about, right? That's, again, if you think about the debate around the bell curve, that's what conservatives were saying, and to some degree, now liberals are hoisting conservatives on their own petard. I kind of think both of these theories are an explanatory dead end. The evidence that either of these theories adequately explains the representation of conservatives in the social sciences and humanities in particular seems to me to be thin. The magnitude and the trajectory of the outcome seems to outweigh the power of the explanations. Note, I also think this is true in the case of race and most other categories too. Also, these two categories are deliberative dead ends, right? They're usually deployed more as totems of tribal identity because they're designed to shift the blame, right? The purpose of the discrimination theory is to say, you know, it's you, right? It's you who are, you know, who are doing this to you. It's you, hiring committee, right? So you need to change your ways, right? Whereas typically the other position on the university side is to say, no, it's you, because you're stupid and greedy or just backward, right? So I don't think either one of those is really, if we actually think this is an actual problem that deserves remedies, they're not going to push us toward remedies. Okay, so what are alternative theories that would get us closer to a set of actual remedies for the problem? Right, one is, and we had this referred to a little bit, was what you might call the pipeline / propensity to play theory. And this is where this part of my talk gets very Tom Schelling-y, so if you don't like at least baby game theory, you should probably check your email. So in this theory, discrimination matters not just at the moment that a discrete decision on a particular applicant is made, but on a range of future decisions, right? So the discriminatory act in this theory affects not just the person discriminated against, but a whole bunch of people who are in some sense observing the discriminatory act, right? So actors in this system have imperfect information about the actual extent of discrimination, right? Lots of the rest of the argument I'm going to make is based on the fact that people actually don't know how much discrimination there is, right? So again, in other fields they refer to this as the social construction of discrimination, but I think that's actually how these things work, right? People are highly dependent upon socially constructed group beliefs, like urban myths, right? About the magnitude of discrimination. That's how people actually draw their knowledge about what's going on in the social world, is through tribal knowledge, right? The common sense of the group to which they belong. So in this theory, applicants who believe, whether it's true or not, and this is a very important part of my theory, right, that most of these mechanisms are independent of whether these group beliefs actually correspond to the actual facts. If applicants believe that discrimination exists, they will, at the margin, reduce their propensity to play at all, right? So there's one thing we know: if people believe they're going to be discriminated against, then they're not going to play, right? This is actually one of the reasons why, at least in some cases, occupational licenses seem to increase the number of people who go into a field, because it reduces their perceived belief that there's discrimination. So we can come back to that later. So if a group believes wrongly that there's little discrimination, in equilibrium, its tendency to play the game will be high, right? So again, whether it's not true, right? So it may be the case that you have a group that's actually discriminated against, but they don't believe they are, so they're going to play a lot and then lose a fair amount, right, in this theory, right? And inversely, if a group believes wrongly that there's a lot of discrimination, its tendency to play the game will be low, and there'll be relatively low incidence of discrimination, the belief that there is having done most of the work. So conservatives' positions in the academy may be shaped both by the actual operation of discrimination in reducing the number of players who win, but also by the way that perceptions of discrimination reduce their propensity to play in the first place. Note also that if few conservatives apply because of a belief in the high incidence of discrimination, university faculties may come to believe that there is in fact little interest or even aptitude among conservatives in becoming academics, which could lead to a low assessment of the average interest or aptitude of conservatives for academic work, right? That this process would be in some sense self-reaffirming. So this could lead to a vicious cycle even without much of the initial element of invidious discrimination. That is, the process itself would endogenously produce the preferences, right, that would create it. If that's right, and this is the tough love part of the talk that's coming, so prepare yourself. Conservatives themselves contribute to this mechanism when they create a generally accepted group belief that discrimination is high. That is true, again, whether the claim that there's a lot of discrimination is right or wrong. By making the discriminatory character of academia a point of group identity, right, which anybody who reads most conservative magazines could have a hard time denying that this is now, again, a kind of shibboleth of group identity. You have the indirect effect of helping to reinforce the equilibrium you want to disrupt. That was mechanism one. Mechanism two is what in law is usually referred to as disparate impact, right? That is the unintended effect of structural features designed for other purposes, right? So two mechanisms in this. One, so in the universities, incumbents determine what's important and what fields are searched in. They lobby for additional positions and subjects incumbents care about, or simply replicate the existing distribution of fields, which in universities have presumptive legitimacy. To the degree that conservative value fields like the study of religion or the military that incumbents don't, the process of determining what fields will be searched in will have a disparate impact, even if there's no conscious intent to discrimination as a result of the mismatch between the jobs available and the skills or tastes that conservatives possess. Two, in the day-to-day process of the university, incumbents make decisions that make those in power, or those capable of gaining leverage over those in power, comfortable and at home, right? We do this informally all the time, right? About the ways we determine group norms or practices or manners, all kinds of things, right? Make people who already control power, right, comfortable, and make people on the outside often not, right? In my group, right, often representation of Jews is so high that people use a kind of informal discussion, right? That in-group kind of language and norms or experiences of New York, right, all becomes their patois, right? And outsiders are going to feel uncomfortable, right? That wasn't intended as a discriminatory measure, but it can act as one, right? So those on the left will generally make the university work for those in positions of power like themselves, without much consideration for whether it makes those on the outside, like conservatives, understand that the university is not really for them. And this is where this mechanism sort of, feeds into the mechanism I was talking about before, right? All those norms of the university, practices and rituals, to some degree, can have a discriminatory effect by making people believe there would be discrimination even if there was not. Okay. Third, and this is related to the work that Josh did, one of the responses to perceived discrimination is the strategic presentation of self. That is, whether it's because of in-group beliefs about the extent of discrimination or the disparate impact of university culture, at the margin, conservatives will come to believe that they cannot effectively operate in the university if they're out. They will consequently either quit the game, right? That was the earlier equilibrium we talked about, or engage in what Timur Kuran calls preference falsification. That is, they'll strategically act as if they are other than what they know themselves to be. While not everyone plays the game this way, many do. We all know some of these people, right? We can think of this strategy as a psychological tax that conservatives pay, whether or not it's in fact the case that they have to pay it, right? That's the really important thing to keep coming back to, that others do not. That is, there's time and effort and mental energy devoted to strategic construction of identity that those who fit with the existing standard of academics do not have to expend, right? And again, all things being equal, as you know, for economics, you increase the price of something, you get less of it. I'll just remind you again that the parallel here to the situation of ethnic and racial minorities is precise and intended. The strategic manipulation of identity reduces the payoff of the job for conservatives, as well as the anticipated future pleasures of the job for those who are in grad school or considering, right? They're looking at it and saying, I could do it, but it's going to be a pain. I'm going to have to do all these things, right? Maybe I'll do something else, right? Or it reduces their ability to design research agendas that allow them to explicitly use the research enterprise to act on their fundamental beliefs. That reduces the payoff of the job and therefore whether you get it. Next, exit options, right? Exit options are usually presented as the answer, but I'm going to say they're part of the problem, right? The other part of the equation in the labor market, right, is what other options players in the labor market have, right? Whether conservatives attempt to get jobs is partially a function of whether they're able to get positions that, while not as desirable as those in academia, still allow them to pursue intellectual work. This applies even to people who play in earlier stages of the game, but then who then choose the option which is lower risk and more enjoyable in the short term, such as working in a think tank, even if they would have a decent shot at the higher risk but higher payoff option of trying the academic labor market. The more attractive the think tank option is, therefore, the lower the number of conservatives who pursue the higher risk, higher payoff academic option. Since the size of the conservative think tank world continues to increase, you can make the obvious surmise that it may be reducing the probability of entrance into the academy if it encourages smart young conservatives to make choices that reduce their willingness to enter academia or their qualifications for doing so. But the other logical implication is it might be increasing the number of young people playing the game in academia and reducing their engagement in preference falsification because they know they have a relatively intellectually stimulating insurance policy, right? They can go, they can gamble, try and be the next Harvey Mansfield. They fail, then they can, you know, they can go and get a great think tank job. If they didn't have that insurance, then they wouldn't play at all. Okay, one more. Ghettoization. This is the last one. A second institutional response to perceived discrimination and the disparate impact of university culture is creating parallel institutions, enclaves in universities, typically those of lower status. I say that just in an objective sense, not like a snobby way. This can sometimes work in the sense of breaking down discrimination if the enclave is recognized by the larger academic world as producing work of higher status, right? That is, if you create an enclave and then everybody else says, whoa, look at all this awesome work they did, we want some of that, right? Then the enclave strategy can be useful for breaking down discrimination system-wide. If you think about the role that the University of Rochester played in the 1970s and 80s, right? That kind of work was not particularly attractive before. They created an enclave, they produced all this work, they dominated the APSR, and then everybody said they wanted some of that. But that strategy can also produce ghettoization if the work does not generate the perception of high status, in which case students may be attracted into the enclave because of the lower short-term cost of doing so, since they'll be surrounded by those they agree with and have to make fewer adjustments to their preferred career course, but with higher long-term costs, since they'll have to be satisfied with positions even in lower status institutions or in non-academic jobs, or being outside of intellectual work entirely. So I could go into, I've already been talking too long, so I have a whole what should be done thing, but we'll have to wait till questions to get to that.
All right, I'll just stay here, I think. So first, am I ringing, or is it? No, okay, good. I do have to say that we did identify more than one conservative. You were identified, but we also identified Harvey but that was only because other people identified him. And so we apologize for not keeping you anonymous. America was shocked to learn that Harvey Mansfield is conservative after our book came out. Although we didn't identify, we quoted him, but we didn't identify which quotes came from him. But it really was because, I guess in the language of quantitative work, a non-trivial number of the faculty we interviewed said that either taking a class with Harvey or just his general reputation helped shape their intellectual development as well and political development. So I will say a little bit about our book before jumping into what I think are some of the problems. Some of this I can abbreviate because it's already been discussed. Particularly by April. This book that John Shields and I wrote, we interviewed 153 academics in 6 disciplines in the social sciences and humanities. And in our second interview, the person asked us, well, what are you doing? And we said, well, we're trying to interview about 150 self-identified conservative professors in the social sciences and humanities. And he asked us if we were going to raise the dead. And that was a good question to ask. It was a very good question to ask, particularly when you think about some disciplines. So there are about 6,000 sociologists in the United States, and we found 12 who are willing to be interviewed by us. There are probably more, but of course they're deeply hidden, and so their politics don't really matter that much if you're concerned about some of the things that I'm going to talk about. In fact, the methodology that we use to identify faculty in some of these disciplines is telling in its own right. We had to use what's called a snowball sample, and a snowball sample is used with difficult to locate populations like the homeless. So people without fixed addresses or phone numbers. Can you tell me where I can find 10 more people like you? That's what we had to do. So we would identify a conservative sociologist and ask him, can you tell us where we can find 10 more people like you? And no one came close to 10, I'll tell you, in sociology and in several other disciplines. So, of course, the fact that we had to use the same method that you used to study the homeless to study conservatives, I think, is illustrative. As well, you see that in the social sciences, about 18% of social scientists self-identify as Marxist. 18%, while only 5% self-identify as conservative. So for decades, conservatives have been making jokes about how there are more communists in faculty lounges than there are in China. Now we actually have the data, right, to prove this. The problem is also getting worse, if you think it's a problem. So in 1990, 41% of professors identified as being on the far left, while in 2014, 60% identified as being on the far left. In 1990, 18% identified as conservative, and 2014, 13% identified as conservative. As well, if you look at, there's been more recent research that shows that the faculty, particularly younger cohorts of faculty, tend to be more liberal or self-identify as liberal than older faculty, so this is going to only increase over time. I also like to say that the effective representation of conservatives is lower than their actual numbers, precisely because they hide their politics. So in our book, what we found was that about a third of the professors we interviewed hid their politics from their colleagues. And then if you exclude economics, it was half. Half hid their politics. And so there are reasons for doing that. Economics is different for a variety of reasons. So if you actually, there are certainly more people out there, more conservatives out there that are hiding their politics. So if you think it's important to have a range of viewpoints, if people are just hiding their politics, it doesn't really matter. It does seem there seems to be a point where you need to have a certain critical mass of heterodox opinions in a department or in a field or on a college campus in order for people to feel free to express their opinions. All right, so what are the problems then that might rise from this underrepresentation from the viewpoint homogeneity on campus? I'll talk about 4. 2 of them are based on the core mission of the university, and then 2 of them would be based on the self-interest of the university. So appeal to honor and then appeal to interest. So the first would be teaching. So I think there's a cost because of the viewpoint homogeneity on campus, the echo chamber on campus. The primary problem is, though, not the one that conservatives tend to identify, which is indoctrination. A lot of times conservatives say, oh, these students, they're showing up to campus, and then they go into the class, and then the professor beats them over the head with their liberal agenda, and then they come out good little soldiers for the left. And there's not a lot of evidence for that. In fact, April's husband, and maybe April herself, they've done some research on this.
I'm usually the first author when people cite
Yes,
Matthew.
okay, yeah. So showing that these classes, these indoctrination classes aren't really that effective. And there's other research on this, and the research on corporate diversity programs as well. They tend to increase the attitudes that they're trying to decrease. So they're counterproductive. So I actually don't think that that's as big a problem as conservatives like to say. I do think it winds up being a colossal waste of educational resources, that the time in class could be spent on other subjects, real subjects, but it doesn't tend to increase the liberal attitudes of students. Instead, I think what the 2 most important costs for education for teaching are, one, civic education. I'm going to not talk about that since April really talked about that if you have a range of voices on campus, you can model deliberative virtues for students, and that prepares them. But then also, I think that a second problem is that students aren't exposed to the range of ideas that are necessary for being an effective citizen in a pluralistic society. So it's certainly possible to get an elite education in the United States, sounds like Canada as well, without being exposed to serious books or ideas by conservatives. And the example that we like to use is John Haidt, who, of course, started Heterodox Academy, but in his book, The Righteous Mind, he discusses something that happened in his own life. And at this point, he was already, I believe, a full professor at the University of Virginia. Gone to elite institutions his entire career, taught at elite institutions. And he talked about how he was going through a used bookstore, and he came across a shocking book with a shocking title. Jerry Muller's Conservatism, an anthology of social and political thought from David Hume to the present. Well, this is an oxymoron. Conservative thought, what's that? Right? There's no such thing as conservative thought. And he said, I started reading his introduction while standing in the aisle. But by the third page, I had to sit down on the floor. He says, I was quite literally floored by the recognition that there was a kind of conservatism that could compete against liberalism in the court of social science. So I began to see that conservatives had attained a crucial insight into the sociology of morality that I had never encountered before. And the way I like to think about this is, can you imagine this happening in reverse? That is, can you imagine a conservative professor teaching at a major elite research university, stumbling into a used bookstore and finding an anthology of progressive thought and being shocked by the arguments in the book? Oh, wow, corporations sometimes are greedy, right? Or something like, I don't know what, it's impossible to imagine this. It's impossible. So, but on the left, you can certainly go through America's educational institutions and never actually be exposed to conservative ideas. So teaching, I think it creates a problem. A second area, research. Right? So you think teaching is a fundamental purpose of the university, research as well. A generation of new ideas and exploration, trying to find the truth. And so I think that there are a couple of problems that we see with the echo chamber on campus that it creates for research. One is that important questions go unasked. Right? They're just important questions that are never addressed because there aren't people around who would be interested in them. We'll also talk about some areas where maybe people intentionally now, well, in the past and now will certainly just avoid asking them because they don't want to risk career suicide. But then also confirmation bias is another problem. And that's where, because you have a homogeneous group of people, no one asks the difficult questions necessary to actually challenge the arguments, make them better, see if the evidence actually holds up. So confirmation bias is simply the tendency of human beings to accept findings and theories that are consistent with our pre-existing beliefs. Francis Bacon actually had a very good description of this, so this isn't anything new. He said, once the human mind has favored certain views, it pulls everything else into agreement and support for them. Should they be outweighed by more powerful countervailing considerations, it either fails to notice these or scorns them or makes fine distinctions in order to neutralize and so reject them. So confirmation bias, and I think I'll give some examples where I think you see both of these at work. One area where I think it's interesting is the progressive era, so research on the progressive era in the United States. Typically, if you read a high school textbook or even a college textbook on the progressive era, the progressives were the good people and the people who opposed the progressives were the bad people, and then some of the dodgier parts of the progressive movement are ignored. And one area that was ignored and no one really talked about or researched until an economics professor at Princeton, Thomas Leonard, started studying it, was the relationship between the support for the minimum wage and the eugenics movement during the progressive era. It turns out that the progressive era economists were aware that the primary effect of a minimum wage by increasing the price of labor was decreased consumption of it. And they said, well, this is fantastic because now the unfit people won't be able to get jobs. And they said, we won't be able to chloroform these people. They actually said this. We won't be able to chloroform the people yet, but at least we'll be able to isolate them. And so you see this, this is just something that's just been ignored. I'll mention my own co-author, John Shields. So his first book was called The Democratic Virtues of the Christian Right. So there was a common narrative about the social conservatives, which was that they were dogmatic, closed-minded, unwilling to engage in reasoned discourse, and you particularly saw this in the pro-life movement. And John said, well, that's interesting. Why don't I actually go and observe some of these pro-life activists? And what he found was that the modern-day pro-life movement tries to limit its arguments to ones based on testable facts and shared principles. I do like the fact one reviewer said that the title of John's book was something akin to the winning ways of serial killers. This is so shocking for a modern academic. Another example, sociology, the discipline of sociology. For several decades, there was a disciplinary commitment to minimize the importance of family structure and the outcomes for children. And if you want a good example of this, just go read about what prominent sociologist said in reaction to Dan Quayle's Murphy Brown speech. I can't believe someone would actually say something like this. They all tried to say that family breakdown doesn't have significant effects, children are resilient, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Eventually, though, the evidence became so overwhelming that they couldn't resist it anymore. It just turns out that family structure really, really matters. It's one of the primary determinants of a child's life prospects. So one sociologist that we interviewed put it this way. He said, basically, sociology had to be dragged kicking and screaming until it recognized that broken families aren't a good thing. It's like if you had to spend decades and millions of dollars in National Science Foundation grants to convince astronomers that the sun rises in the east. This is a decades-long commitment by a particular discipline to overwhelming empirical error. Right? And then finally, I will just bring up the today. You think about the effects of same-sex parenting on children. You look at what happened to Mark Regnerus at the University of Texas. I think that in the aftermath of that, no one is even going to gather data anymore on the effects of same-sex parenting on children. It's just too risky. It's just too risky. And this is, of course, a major change in society where we're now engaging in something that's never really been tried before in human history. It's probably important for us to figure this out, right? What the effects are. That doesn't mean that you have to change people's rights, but it would be important to know if there are certain things that are advantageous or disadvantageous. But no one is going to research this anymore. It's just simply too dangerous. Okay, so those are two problems based on the core functions of the university. So appeal to the university's honor, then appeal to the university's interest. And I won't say much on these. I'll just be very brief with them. So politics. I think that the echo chamber of the university matters for politics, primarily because universities, particularly in public universities, in state legislatures, are what I like to call a soft budgetary target. It's really easy to go after them. Even private universities as well. You think about the Republican tax plan. I've spoken with some Republican staffers on Capitol Hill, and they'll just say, yeah, it was an easy target, and those people don't like us. So why not go after them? It's not. Or you think about a few years ago, for a very dark moment for political science. So Congress actually shut off National Science Foundation funding for political science for a year. And the incalculable harm that this did to the cause of science, right, really set it back. But you think about it, Senator Inhofe, I believe, was the one who was behind that after. I think you can see more and more of these attacks on the university coming both from state legislatures and from Congress. And then the final problem of caused by the lack of viewpoint diversity is policy. So if the university thinks that it's actually generating research that policymakers should listen to, the fact that it's coming out of what policymakers view as an echo chamber is only going to limit the influence of that policy. Particularly Republican policymakers, members of Congress and state legislators, but others as well. Even Democrats have sometimes you can see them expressing skepticism about research generated in the academy. Why should we believe in that? You all believe the same thing anyway. What you produced is unreliable. Thank you.
Okay, so what I'm going to do now is declare this panel to be the committee of the whole, since we're a small group, and move to plenary session. Let me ask a couple of follow-up questions or expansion questions. One is none of you talked much about, I know you do in your book, I think a little bit, none of you talked a lot about the question of where do you find pockets of conservative strength in the academy? Economics, business schools, I suppose, except I'm not sure that really counts. Law schools, right? Part
little
of it's
more.
Little more, but more than other disciplines. But I'm talking comparative terms, right? And that's, Steve obviously knows a lot about this. That's a very deliberate effort over 35 years by the Federal Society to cultivate and both faculty members. Political science, you find them chiefly in political philosophy or political theory, some in institutional. Very few, I think, in the what I can say is the successors of the behaviorists have won. A lot of the elite political science departments, I think, tend to be dominated. I haven't tried to quantify this, so maybe this is wrong, but my impression is by the regression modeling methodology, right? And not many conservatives are attracted to those fields. In history, social history has really come to dominate. And even a couple of universities, I think Wisconsin a few years ago, tried to find someone for a position in military history and couldn't find anybody because there aren't many people studying it, because there haven't been many jobs in it, right? Diplomatic history, those are dying areas of interest in academic history. And so some of that may not have to do as much with ideology. I mean, there's some complaints about this that we can make, that the critique conservatives have had of social science in general. But some of these are just the sort of the conventions that have hardened in certain disciplines that conservatives, for various reasons that I think are not fully well understood, find unattractive and unappealing. So this also becomes a reinforcing problem. So that's a big, long, rambling statement. Anyone want to grab hold of that and run with it somewhere?
Yeah, I mean, that was a little bit what I was referring to when I was talking about this disparate impact theory of representation. So it is interesting to think about what the logical response to that mechanism, I think, is obviously present, right? I was talking to a conservative PhD holder, who's a pretty major figure in the conservative movement, and he was actually bemoaning this. He was saying, look, there are all these pockets of political theory by conservatives. Generally, not again. The academia is has a very strong. There's like a power law distribution of where people go into academics, right? You have a very small number of places at the top who have what Bourdieu referred to as sort of social deeming function. They can kind of wave their hand over someone and then you drop out really quickly, right? But conservatives, lots of young conservatives, are drawn to those places that are in those fields, right? Where they say, oh, well, there's lots of political theorists at these sort of less ranked institutions. I'll go there because they'll be nice to me and they'll take good, and I'll think I'll get a good education. But then, given that that highly elitist structure of where people hire people from, then they can't get jobs, or they can only get jobs at places even further down the status hierarchy. Now, again, that's one thing where the Federal Society, who I talked to this afternoon before this, they were very clear that they were going to focus on the most highly ranked institutions. So they said, if you want to get people into other jobs, right, what you need to do is you need to get people into those higher ranked institutions, right, often in fields where there's significant demand, right, for faculty, and then you need to get them through the process, right? So, I do think in some sense, one of the problems is by going into the fields where conservatives already want and then building strength in that, you're trying to shove a lot of people into something where there's just not a lot of demand, right? I think in some cases the better strategy would be to try to actually get people into mainstream institutions, studying the fields that at least right now have relatively high status, right, and where there's a significant number of jobs. And where, in fact, I think there's actually a lot of demand. We had this with a woman who applied to our graduate program in sociology at Johns Hopkins, in demography, which people usually think of as a fairly significantly left field, right? But actually, there's a lot of reasons why conservatives might want to study it. Family is one of the reasons you might think of. But all it took was, in fact, for somebody on the inside to sort of convince her that actually things would be fine. Right, that she'd be taken care of, and they wanted her there, right? Which I think suggests one mechanism for change, which is it's not just that you need to get conservatives into places, right? It's that you need what you really need is a critical mass of what you might call righteous Gentiles, right? That is, you need more, right, liberals who are sort of philo-conservative, right, who are going to say, I'm making myself known, right, that I would like to have conservatives come and study with me, that I'm happy to have them study these subjects, right, in institutions that have the social deeming sort of prestige to be able to get people into jobs.
Either one of you want to grab a hold of that? There's a
Sure. Oh yeah. I think Steve's right about the righteous Gentiles, and I won't identify the person, but there is one person in this room who was a false positive for us, so we could play a guessing game. That is someone who was identified as conservative, who we actually knew wasn't conservative. But we'll leave that aside. You can talk to me afterwards about it. But I think that does matter. But I will say, part of the issue is that political science has turned into something of a fallback discipline for a lot of conservatives because, one, it's fairly poorly defined, and so you can do a lot of different things with it. And then some subjects, let's say you want to study military history, and history doesn't allow you to do that anymore or reward it. You can study international relations and politics, study war. So that is an option. Also, there are more conservatives in the quantitative part of political science than you would imagine. Rational choice lends itself to some conservative conclusions. In fact, John and I were interviewing a major rational choice scholar, and he was. But this is one of the interesting things about political science is that the quantitative conservatives and the qualitative conservatives weren't or aren't really aware of each other's existence. And so we were interviewing and we talked, well, so what are the conservatives you know in political science? And so he listed a few other very hardcore rat choice types. And then we actually said, well, what about, like Harvey Mansfield? And he was like, oh yeah, there are those people, right? So he was just, it completely escaped his mind that there often political philosophy, there were conservatives. So it tells you something about the discipline too, that methodological divide ends up being such a high barrier.
April, do you want? Well, okay, so now let me flip it around and say I think there is also a substantive, there's also a difficulty that arises from substantive ideological differences of outlook. So, and part of this is the nature of the university that makes sense. Research university is about breaking new knowledge and, right. Conservatives like to think about the old things, and so in the area of social science, the fact-value distinction, that's sort of yesterday's news. I mean, that's several yesterdays' news. That argument was started 100 years ago and started to flame out 50 years ago. Now, what I like to say is that, yeah, it may be sort of old stuff to us, but it's not old stuff to the next generation of students. And unless you have some component of intellectual history as part of disciplines, which varies from discipline to discipline, place to place, I think some of these old debates that go by the wayside, I think, are actually worthy of having over again. And conservatives like to do that, but I think there's less interest and respect for that in an awful lot of universities today. I think that's a factor that plays into things. Does that make any sense at all? Or is that totally weird?
Yeah, if you're asking me.
Well, yeah, because I want to pick on somebody. Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I mean, I think that's a thing, right? That's an actual phenomenon in the world. If I'm thinking about leverage points, though, right? The thing where you're going to try to crack something open in order to create more space, right? That's not the place to do it, right? And this is, I guess, my big point is, if you want more conservatives, right? That's one thing. If you want to change people's perceptions of what's important to study and what's not, that's another, right? If you're trying to do both simultaneously, right, that's a much bigger lift, right? I think, and this is my point is, if you're trying to convince people that things they don't think are important, right? And then to get conservatives in by reprioritizing those things that people have decided are less significant, there's a good moral or ethical or pedagogical reason for that. But it's not, but strategically, right, in purely Machiavellian terms, right, I'm talking to, right, it wouldn't be if I was a general in this fight, it wouldn't be where I would send my army to first.
Yeah, Harvey, you had a hand up on this, or the whatever.
Yes, I loved the cascade of paradoxes that Steve Nubbins put up, and I recognized in ghettoization a description of certain friends of mine. I thought, but I have a question that's not so much a paradox as a dilemma. That I would ask you this: arguing for intellectual diversity, it's better to present conservatism as beneficial or as tolerable. If it's beneficial, then you're trying to get the people who oppose you to say that they are wrong, I guess. And that, I'm wrong, and I've been opposing conservatism all my life, but now I see, since there's so few of you, that I was wrong all that time. Whereas on the other hand, so then you switch to the strategy of presenting conservatism not as beneficial, but as tolerable. And it's perceived as threatening, but it isn't. And in any case, maybe when you say perceived as threatening, what you mean is misperceived. But then if you do that, then you're equating conservatism with communism. And that's been done by a couple of them.
Right.
And does one really want to accept that? There is a real difference between conservatism, which is beneficial, and communism, which is extremely harmful. And the Communist Party was indeed actually not tolerable. It was a spy agency for the Soviet Union. And the same thing with Muslim radicals. They're murderers. They need to be found out and exposed and dealt with. So it isn't that everything is tolerable, and this old liberal ACLU position on toleration is very nice now to have the support of Alan Dershowitz.
You can have him.
Well, that seems wrong too. So which is the way to go?
I think it's a false dichotomy. So I think you can argue that something is beneficial and not argue that it's right if you focus on the process. And the left does this all the time, right? We want these conservative students to be exposed to our ideas because exposure to new ideas helps them critically think through their ideas. And there's a great argument that the students that are really suffering in the academy today are the ones on the left who don't go through that same challenge and that same defending their ideas. And so I think if you focus on the process, that works. But I've also, and this is something I've tried to do for Heterodox Academy, I also think intellectual diversity can't be just limited to more conservatives. And so I've made the case that, I chair a department that includes the philosophy, whatever's left of the program. It's minor. And, in philosophy, there's this great critique that there is not as much openness to non-Western views, to feminist views. And so to appeal to the left as well, I say, when we're talking about intellectual diversity, we would all benefit from it. And if there are disciplines that aren't as open to non-Western views and feminist views, they also would benefit. Again, not because we're saying they're right, but just because critiquing perspectives and with counter perspectives is a productive intellectual exercise that makes us more affirmed in our positions, if nothing else.
Go ahead.
I mean, I'm strongly on the side of beneficial rather than toleration, right? Part of it is the toleration smacks too much of pity, and maybe I'm enough of a Nietzschean to be offended by arguments for pity. But I think so. I think one, right, the argument, and this gets to that point that you don't necessarily need to believe something is right, to believe that it would be beneficial. But if you believe that we're all partial, right, that is, it has to do something with fallibility, right? That is, that we all see through, through a glass darkly, right? And that both conservatism and liberalism, right, have partial views of the whole, right? And that one thing a university wants is not to try and get everybody right at the, what people think is the most likely right position, right? But have along that distribution, right? Since we all, and again, especially that distribution is a result of the reality of the pluralism of the human good, right? And that our ideologies in part come from people overemphasizing or heightening one part of that element of the human good. The other argument, I think the strongest argument, is that whether we like it or not, conservatives exist, right? I think about this in Amy Binder's wonderful book on conservatives. I think we can now say it's at Colorado and Harvard. And she was very clear that the students at Harvard, the style of conservatism, right, was actually one that Harvey was very influential in creating. Bookish, right? The strategy of that is to say, we're more intellectual than you, right? We're going to shame you by how much more bookish and intellectual we are, whereas you're just all, just engaged in politics, right? Whereas but that depended on the existence of somebody to set that tone, right? Whereas at Boulder, she makes very clear the absence of any conservatives meant that essentially the conservatives were like latchkey kids who have been left at home with Fox News, right? Which is why their idea what conservatism was affirmative action bake sales. It was things that were, again, what you basically referred to as trolling, right? That idea, which they picked up, is anything that gets liberals, riled up and pissed off is what conservatism is.
So, in other words, your bumper sticker would be more Harvey, less Hannity.
Yes.
Well, I can go for that. I give a political answer that's somewhat mischievous, which is beneficial in the same sense that you say, eat your spinach, it's good for you. And the argument, I do sort of play out the argument something like this, but I'll put it this way for this audience, is I do enjoy sometimes watching how upset liberals get with Fox News, this one news outlet, right, that's sort of self-consciously conservative. I think it lots of defects, it's a long story. The planned recriminations issue of National Review after the Trump loss was going to include a cover story on what's wrong with Fox News that got us in this disaster. That obviously went in the trash can. Anyway, but I do like to say, when people say that about Fox News, they bring it up, I say, imagine how people like me have thought over the years reading the New York Times every day. It says, but we read the New York Times every day. It makes us better. It's eating our spinach, because then we know how liberals think, and that gives us an advantage in political battles and thinking things through. And forget Fox News. You should read. I mean, I read I read a lot of liberal journals, the serious ones, American Prospect, Democracy, and some of the others. And I feel like I'm better for doing that. You get through serious arguments, not just slogans and so forth. And so I say that's why you ought to. It'll make you better at being a liberal or a leftist. And just tell one quick story here. About Berkeley. It's kind of very typical, right? As like my first day here, not first day, but talking to some of the development office and say, gosh, it'd be great if you could get some conservative speakers to Berkeley. We'd really love it if you could help us get Olympia Snow. And, fine lady, I mean, I do better through time, but that's Berkeley's idea of what a conservative is, right? At least some of the administration people. And I think, this is pretty comical. This is going to be fun. Anyway, Larry Alexander.
I'm going to tell a little story about our law school, which probably has a much higher proportion of political conservatives than most law schools. But there's a reason. When I joined the faculty, I was a left of center type professional, or extreme liberal, so we say, and I fit right in. There were no real conservatives on the faculty.
Not even Bernie Segan? Did you overlap with him?
Bernie came.
Okay.
Bernie wasn't, but Bernie didn't have a tenure track. He had a special.
I see. Okay.
Contractual position. But at a certain point, it was a backwater law school, and I and a couple of others had real ambitions for raising the profile of the school, and there was clearly up the food chain, there was discrimination against conservatives, and I convinced enough colleagues. This is not inability of this, but I convinced enough colleagues that we should take advantage of the market defects.
Yeah.
That we were getting people who should have been on the faculty at Harvard and Yale, but because of their views, they were not getting played with. So we hired them. And my colleagues discovered, one, that conservatives could be smart, even smarter than they. And two, the conservatives were not evil, but they actually were good people and were as interested in human welfare as they were. There was a minority on the faculty that didn't see it this way, but over time, just the presence of having those people on the faculty, first, some people like me learned a lot from them and changed. I changed my views and others changed their views because of the force of the intellects of these people. And we wanted more to be right than to have our previous views vindicated. And so, as painful as it is sometimes to admit that you were wrong about something and somebody else was right, sometimes you're just forced to it if you get all open-minded. Over the years, the presence of those people meant that we started hiring people based on the most meritocratic views we have. And of course, it's of course always difficult to separate out the fact that this person seems competent in the discipline from the fact that you don't agree with their conclusions. That's one of the hardest distinctions to make, but you can make it, and people do. And so it got to be the case that liberals on the faculty would vote for new hires who were conservative, and conservatives would vote for new hires who were liberal, because the idea was to get the smartest people we could, because either we would convince them that we were right, they were wrong, or they would convince us.
Right.
And either way, it was a win. And other schools that would hire conservatives would ghettoize them. So, you could come, but you teach the business stuff, because, we're not so interested in business, but we conservatives are interested in business. But don't teach common law, or don't teach family law, or something of this sort. These are the playthings of people with only the right political views. We don't do that. We didn't do that, much to the benefit. And other schools, one of the things that happened is that even though we're not a top 10 law school in the U.S. The other faculty started to do what we were doing. And so the presence of conservatives in the legal academy, and conservatives who are not ghettoized into certain courses, is much different now, much improved. The presence of Federalist Society, that helps, that provides an effort. But schools have discovered that they benefit from having people they disagree with politically on their faculty. And it was not true 30 years ago. 30 years ago, what we did was quite unusual.
So Steve, tell us, I think, not to comment particularly on San Diego, but I think you will know, I think there's a similar story to be told perhaps about Harvard Law School. I mean, Elena Kagan, I think, said, I want to hire some conservatives, and her successor also, I think. And now the dean of Harvard Law School is actually a conservative, which has blown some minds.
Yeah.
Do I have that right?
There's very limited lessons you can draw from the law school market to the rest of the university, right? For a couple of reasons. In general, the structure, again, sorry to refer to Bourdieu here, but it's actually quite useful in thinking about these, right? The ways that people determine sort of status, right? The things, the markers of merit that get produced that cause people to get hired, right? One is elite clerkships, right?
Yeah.
Are incredibly important. They're less important than they used to be, right? Because now we've got more dual degree stuff. But certainly during this period, they were very important, right? And that's a process that's totally linked to the electoral cycle, right? That is, if conservatives are going on the bench and then they're choosing clerks, right? And if you've got a bunch of conservatives on the Supreme Court, they're the pool of Supreme Court clerks who are then going to get hired, right? So that mechanism is present. It's not present in English.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
So that's, but it is the case that the fact that the Federalist Society did have this process, which to some degree dealt with some of the risk, right, of having fellowships for people who were in that year, because usually people come out, they clerk, and then they go work for a firm for a few years. That used to be the process. They work for a firm for a few years, and they pay off their loans, and then they try and like get their article or get that right. And providing that subsidy of allowing them to go and have some time off to write and apply for jobs and all that, that was helpful. But I do think the fact that you don't have that linkage to political power, right? And law school, at least until you had joint degrees, was drawing from this pool of people who were JDs, right? And that was a very ideologically diverse pool, because a lot of those guys were going out to probate people's wills and stuff, right, as well as doing whatever else.
Right. Let me, unless you want to jump in on, let me bring up, Shep, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to build on what Larry said and use it as an occasion to disagree with Steve, which I like doing. Which is the strategy that Larry really pointed out, I call it Moneyball strategy. Try to figure out what it is that is being undervalued by the top places. And providing finding opportunities for those people. And often those people who deal with political science, it's often people who don't want to do quantitative analysis, but who might have more of an interest in political philosophy, American political philosophy. And the reason I disagree with Steve is I think that indicates that the best strategy is not to try to aim at the most prestigious. Because most people in this country are not educated in a top research university. Most people in top research universities are not educated. There's not much teaching going on. So there's a real job market in small liberalized colleges that still make teaching a priority. And many of the people educated in the large research universities are not interested or not capable of that. So filling that gap, I think, is something that other institutions can do, and that creates a real opening.
I think as the job market gets rough, it's more competitive there than you think. So I have an engineer from Berkeley on my faculty, right? I have people from Yale on my faculty. Last time we had an opening, we had 300 applicants. So we could pick the people from the top institutions if we chose to. And so the ones that stand out are the ones that go to those institutions, but then say, but I have this interest in teaching. They get the liberal arts jobs.
I think maybe my view is skewed by the fact that I do public law, and every school has to have someone who constitutes the law. Or many of them do anyway. And the people who come out of Harvard and Yale and Michigan these days don't do that. Yeah. I'm very interested in that. I think that's
Well, we have to talk about that. This is a project Gene Yarborough and I are trying to sort out. Let me introduce one last angle to all this that didn't fit perfectly well in either one of the panels as they were structured. We'd made reference earlier to the fact that some of the arguments for curtailing free speech trace back to some of these sort of cultural theories of postmodernism, we call them. We didn't spend a lot of time getting into the depths of that. But there's another line now that is emerging literally in the last year in social science. And instead of relying on the linguistic theory or a direct rejection of the liberal tradition in some way, it accepts the liberal tradition and the old John Stuart Mill principle of harm, but says that we have these social science findings or social psychology that speech constitutes the actual or literal equivalent of physical harm, like a blow, in terms of higher anxiety levels, higher stress, and this leads to bad health effects. You've not heard of this, Steve? It's been a couple of op-eds in the New York Times. And now, Shep I have a misspent youth like Shep in the Clean Air Act, and it reminds me a little bit of the arguments over asthma, believe it or not. One of the puzzles or paradoxes of air pollution is that asthma rates have been rising while air pollution's been falling. Here in California, I looked this up a few years ago, the second highest asthma rate is in Marin County, childhood asthma rate, which has no air pollution and never has had any. And so here's what I'm driving to, is that even if you accept this social science at face value, and I think that we're going to see all kinds of defects of it, and by the way, when the EPA does their analysis of different pollution levels, they actually try to quantify the reduction of emergency room visits for asthma attacks. And they'll give you a number out of all that. They may be phony, there's a big part. But one of the things that's emerging in the medical literature is, why are asthma rates rising in the face of falling pollution? And it's not, Marin County, think of who lives there, right? It's sort of rich white kids mostly. And it relates to what you were saying, April. This latest generation has grown up on their phones, before that video games. And there's a lot of medical literature saying, the problem is, to the extent that asthma is partly an autoimmune disease, our kids are not getting out rolling around the dirt enough like kids have forever, and being exposed to microbes and getting sick and doing the things that build up the robustness of your immune system. So my argument is isn't the idea that students need safe dropout spaces, safe spaces, even if you credit those findings at full face value, isn't there the risk that we're going to have an intellectual autoimmune problem, or maybe we have it already? It's a long lead up, sorry, but.
And you started, when you started going somewhere, I wanted to add that it's actually even gone further than what you said. So there are now arguments that restricting hate speech is actually protecting free speech, because the argument is that hate speech suppresses and makes people so afraid that they can't exercise their voice. So in limiting hate speech, we are protecting the speech and the expression rights of the minority groups that would otherwise be traumatized by the speech.
Yeah.
And so it even goes further. It uses free speech.
I mean, I'm not thrilled with any of the framing of any of these problems as free speech, right? Maybe a little bit back to some things we were talking about before, right? I think certainly to what George was talking about, right? The purpose of the university is not just to be a forum, right? It's to produce certain kinds of excellences, right? And and there's a number of things we can think about, right? But there are certain kinds of speech that we certainly don't at least want to subsidize or try to form for, because we say that's not the form of excellence we're trying to model, right? So, and again, that's not an ideological point, right? I think people would say that a certain ideological, perspective is just inherently, right, is inherently hateful or whatever, right? But certainly, just to go back, I mean, because I think this example of, Milo, and I think we can all think about the other people we would put in the same category, right? What is the actual merit in terms of the creation of intellectual or moral excellences that's generated by that, right? I can tell you what those are for lots of conservative speakers, right? But certainly not for them, right? And that's a set of actors who, in some sense, right? I mean, I think you referred to it, right? Is there's a business model, right? That's advantageous for the individual in that case, but is disadvantageous for the brand, right? That's essentially what they're doing, is they're free riding on the brand, right? But making, and so I think that's a part of this story, right? Again, which is in some ways one of the conservative responses to this, is say, oh yeah, we'll like send you,
right.
Milo, right? That only, again, reinforces and deepens the problem, right? And so, again, that's why I go back to Harvey's point. Actually, in some sense, a lot of these more, we think, is classically liberal language, whether it's tolerance or free speech or whatever, is sort of beside the point, given that we have an institution that does, in fact, have a collective purpose, right? Now, you can criticize the university for not serving that purpose, right, in many ways, and saying that these departments that people don't like and that are not serving that in, but that's what you should do. You shouldn't criticize them for violating free speech or free inquiry, where you should say that they're not producing the intellectual and moral excellences that we want to advance. And
Yeah, George, yeah.
I mean, on that, I also think of how you define hate speech, really, too, right? I mean, and the biggest problem is when you sweep so widely that you're going to say, hey, if that's offensive to me, right? I mean, so that Heather McDonald trafficking in hate speech kind of argument, that because she's criticizing Black Lives Matter, she's necessarily criticizing African Americans. It's necessarily that hateful and uncomfortable. When you expand it to that degree, that's when it's particularly problematic at a university, right? And in that setting, because then it really is corrosive of the mission. I mean, you're now saying there are going to be certain topics that are very real that we are not going to allow criticism of. But that seems, if you're going to go on this point, aside the First Amendment argument, because I do think like in a place like Berkeley, UVA, and like there could be First Amendment claims that might have purchase. I'm actually kind of skeptical, but I want to put that aside. But the university, Steve was waiting, looking like he's skeptical of it, and I share that skepticism. But when you turn to the university, should the university be cultivating this kind of speech, right? And it seems to me if there's a pretty clear argument that you can say no, right? Now whether it has to allow a Milo on campus is different from saying we want to actively invite them, right? If I can play off Harvey's comments from last night about, the Democrats being party of morons and PhDs. It's like part of the problem seems to be that there are a lot of untutored conservatives who, really make John Stuart Mill's old line about conservative party being a stupid party. That stings, right? I mean, they're acting in that way, and it doesn't seem to either further their own cause or the cause of the university. And one small comment, because I think it ties into an earlier point of Steve's and the kind of the Chef-Steve exchange on the conservatives entering the academy. And one of the things that I note occasionally with conservatives entering the academy is that there is sometimes this insistence, and I've seen it from some of my own colleagues, and when they're talking to would-be PhD students, it's like they want to speak only to academic issues that conservatives care about. And that to me seems like another just self-inflicted wound. I mean, it's like they're going to be like, well, I'm going to be conservative, and I'm going to focus on something that's only conservative, and I'm looking at the profession and I'm saying, to hell with you, I dare you not to look at me. It just seems stupid, right? I mean, and they need, and so I think those sorts of students need more guidance from people at better institutions, often, or higher up the food chain, or just, look, you've got to attach to some kind of professional community to show why they care about the scholarship you're engaged in. And it seems to me there is a strand of conservatism that seems to want to damn that and say, the kinds of things you care about, I don't care about at all, and then you can't be surprised when they don't pay attention to you.
I would just say, going back to your point about this new research on words being a form of violence, I don't expect that to go very far. Simply because if you take the logic of that research and you apply it to conservatives, then there is mass violence being committed against conservatives every day on college campuses, just because these words that offend, right, have the effect of actual physical force. And so I don't like conservatives playing that kind of game too, but ultimately it's going to happen, and so I think it's going to reach a dead end.
You're already seeing it. Some of the most recent protests have been against speakers that were anti-police, or right, and then the pressure comes from outside, not from within the university. But you're seeing.
Well, conservatives started to play the victim card too, and all.
I hadn't thought of that possibility. I just was thinking to myself, is Milo really more stressful than a midterm exam? In this campus, right?
Maybe on today's college campuses, or at least in certain majors, right?
Could be. Right. So Larry, you're gonna have the last word, I think, or just about.
My kids are adults now, so I'm not tapped in, and I have a clear Facebook page, so I don't know about social media. But when I was in high school, there were in groups, and there were things you had to say to be cool, and things that to get along. But they were things about relatively trivial matters. People didn't discuss politics, and they didn't have views on major social issues. So the views that, high school cliques held were pretty shallow, but they weren't particularly important, in people's lives and that thing. I've seen this now in law school classrooms, the phenomenon that you alluded to, where people think, okay, the received view out here on this issue is this, and therefore, while I'm not really sure I agree with it, I'm not going to say anything. They feel intimidated by their peers, and sometimes their views are just as shallow as the Mean Girls in high school. But now it's about political. It's about things that are much more important, and things we'd like them to be able to think about openly and discuss openly, and they're afraid to. And I was wondering if you see the
So I actually think that most of the kids aren't talking about politics as much as we think they are online. But that doesn't mean it doesn't have an effect. I think we are still seeing a situation where, but they don't confront disagreement. And it could be disagreement over whether, any arbitrary social mean girl issue. We are seeing them shy away from that confrontation. And so then when we do try to talk to them about politics, that mindset is there, that confrontation is harmful. And there's actually some studies that show that people experience the same physiological effects of being confronted with disagreement as they do physical harm. The same fight or flight things take over. And so when students are describing it in this way, like emotional harm, that's what they're feeling and experiencing. But I think exposure to that over and over again, like exposure therapy, reduces that over time, and you realize that you're not under threat and you're not under harm and you're okay. But I don't think we're talking about politics as much as we think. There's a small group that are engaged in this gun issue, but the data shows that the interest in politics has declined over time among teens. It's dropping, and they don't read books either. They hate books. Good luck with that.
Oh, dear. Yeah. Well, you all have given us a lot of thought to think about. I've got some wonderful notes, but I am going to declare us adjourned for the afternoon. And thank you all very much.